Excellent. Thank you, Camilla. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Uh, Full disclosure, Shri and I worked together for several years at Intercom, and we went through a number of planning cycles and replanning cycles and adjustment to planning cycles. Um, we probably didn't start off very well, but over those years, I think we developed a pretty good way of going through this, which I think was efficient, which got us to a much more credible plan and allowed us to constantly measure against it and make adjustments. And we want to share some of those lessons learned with you today in this Revcast. So today it's entitled Mastering the Critical Inputs for Revenue Plan Success. And if we go to the next one, we'll probably introduce ourselves. Oh, nope, we've got an agenda. We're going to cover a number of things in here. Again, this is recorded. So if you go back and listen to it, or you look at the transcripts, and if you have any additional questions or are looking for details on any of these things, again, we're more than happy to get back to you, share our experiences further, or even hop on the phone or share some templates. And please ask questions throughout. You can pop them in the chat. Camilla will break in and ask us some of them, or we'll get some of them when we finish this as well. But please don't be shy of asking questions based on what we're talking about throughout this presentation. Shriya, do you want to introduce
Yeah,
yourself?
sure. Thanks, Jeff. Hey everyone, I'm Shriya Ravikumar, and I lead the go-to-market team at Spruce Health, an earlier stage startup in the healthcare communication space. Prior to Spruce, as Jeff mentioned, I spent some time at Intercom, but more broadly, spent over 10 years as a go-to-market strategy and ops practitioner. So today's topic is very near and dear to my heart, especially as we enter September and planning season blues kick in. So excited to chat with all of you today, and yeah, have a low bar for questions. The stuff is tricky, and so happy to answer and share anything I've learned over the past several years.
Thank you, Shriya. I'm Jeff Serlin. I'm a co-founder and the Chief RevOps Officer at Revcast. I have almost a 20-year career in RevOps, sales ops, and doing related things, and been through a ton of planning cycles as well. I've led teams where I've been the only person, and led teams where there's been 30 or more folks as well. So a lot of variety with different motions, with companies at different stages of their evolution. And I hope that some of the experiences I share today are valuable for all of you.
All right. Well, let me kick it off by maybe asking you some questions, Jeff. Let's poke into that 20 plus year of experience. So, Jeff, as you know from personal experience, and certainly when we start off Intercom, where there's really like, wait, what is planning? Like, we're not just taking a top-down number. We now have a sales team. So, I'm curious. Tell us a little bit about how, RevOps. Has been such a critical role in the annual planning process? And what do you think are some of the most important ways in which this team contributes?
Yeah, I think the single biggest thing, well, maybe not the single, because I'll come up with a lot more single biggest things, but the single biggest thing I think RevOps can do is pull it all together. By definition, we're supposed to look across the whole go-to-market function and organization, regardless of where we report. So we have to make sure that we're optimizing the whole and not the individual parts. We have to gather data that shows how the entire supply chain is performing. We have to investigate areas that we're doing well and areas that we're not doing well. We have to make sure that the rocks coming out of marketing are aligned and not conflicting with the rocks coming out of sales. We many times have to sit in the room and sort of bridge the gap, so or mediate, if you will, the differences between some of these teams. Marketing wants sales to increase ASP by 25% so they can deliver less leads, and sales doesn't think there's any path to get there. We also have to make sure other organizations like product are involved. If increasing ASPs or part of growth is that they have to deliver a new product by June 1st, they need to be just as accountable to that, and they need to be a part of the planning process so they know how that impacts everything else. So we have to organize and shepherd the whole thing in the right way, in the right order. And this is where, to me, a planning calendar comes in, the right order, the right sequence, the right people, the right discussions, the right decisions made at the same time. The other thing before I pop it back to you that I think is very important for RevOps is bringing a sense of rationality to this. It's easy, and you've done it, and I think everyone on this phone has, to sit in a conference room and just say things like, we'll increase the win rate to 40%. If you've never had a 40% win rate, why do you think that that's going to happen? Now, maybe you have an aspirational goal to get there. You have to develop some initiatives to get there, but we bring a sense of that rationality into this, because creating a plan that you have no chance of hitting means it's wrong from day one and you're never going to get to where you need to go. I know you have a couple things that you want to share on this as well.
Yeah, just to pull on that thread though, I couldn't agree more on the bringing, this like voice of reason, right? Like as you get this like giant number from your CEO and you're just starting to drag right on a model, I think we do have to be the voice of reason in terms of asking like, okay, great, this, 40% conversion rate will get us there, but what are the reasons to believe that we can make that happen, right? And is there sort of strong, a solid strategy, if you will, behind it. I love that you covered sort of like the role of RevOps as being sort of like this central force, and we talked a lot about like sort of bringing cohesion from the strategy across the company into this. I think the other critical role that RevOps plays is that planning doesn't just stop at like your numbers, right? You've arrived now at your model and your quotas, et cetera, but it plays such an important part in actually actioning said plan. And this is where I love the fact that so many parts of RevOps get involved. Like the RevOps meets planning is not just about your strategy and analytics team building a model and busting out quotas. It's actually every part of RevOps. I think enablement plays a very important part, right? Like once you have your strategy and approach, it's very important to tee this up with your enablement team, for them to understand what levers you're going to pull. And therefore, like, what do they need to be like building out from a game plan perspective? Are we changing our strategy to go up market? Do we need to be working on more consultative sales selling or negotiations training? Are we changing fundamental pricing strategies, right? In which case, like, does your deal desk start getting involved? What does business systems need to do? Are you changing segmentation in the process? How do they need to be gearing up to make sure like simple things like even like lead routing, et cetera, are being set up to enact all of these strategies together for success? So I think you're absolutely right in that RevOps sit right in the center. We sort of like map both strategy, developing like the actual plan and actually executing said plan, and really in a very coordinated way across all the sub functions within RevOps.
Yeah, that's a great point. Everybody has a role to play in achieving your plan. And I think achieving your plan is the key here, not just creating one that looks good in a spreadsheet.
That's
And
right.
if everybody needs to then put together what their organization, whether it's SDRs or SEs or product marketing, and then the teams below it, and then the individual, the things that they're going to do, the old stop, change, continue, that are now aligned with how you're going to achieve your number and the company and org level strategies. And they need to create plans that ladder up to that. And if you don't, you're going to find holes in executing. There is one thing I want to ask you, and it's the last one:
Yeah.
socializing with go-to-market leaders. This is so important. What are some of it's important because they need to feel ownership of the plan and be accountable to the plan. I've sat in too many meetings where a leader misses their number and they say, well, it's finances plan or it's a
Yeah.
RevOps plan.
Yeah.
What are some of the tactics that you found to be helpful in helping to socialize this with the people that literally get fired if they don't deliver?
Yeah, great question. I think for me, it's about getting them involved and getting them involved early and often. So, as we'll get into in subsequent slides, as we talk about sort of like the ingredients and the inputs, a big part of, I think, developing your plan is, of course, understanding like where the company as a whole is going, but having go-to-market leaders be very involved in the how this is all going to happen. Like, what do you believe your team can and cannot do in order to hit the plan, right? And get them involved early in sort of developing the strategies and developing what we call rocks, but which are really just initiatives. Like, what do we need to do with outbound? Like, how much more do we think we can bring? Marketing, if we're going to start, opening up outbound as a channel, what is like the contribution that you guys have to play in it? And planning is such an iterative process. And so the worst thing you can do is go off into your cave, build a plan, and then present like a 90% baked plan to your leaders and be like, here it is. What comments do you have? I think it's just so important that you bring them along for the ride. And so one of the very tactical things I do in planning season is actually to have like a weekly or maybe even bi-weekly meeting with leaders specifically on this topic and sort of bring them along the journey of like, okay, we've now made assumptions. Well, actually, the very first thing meeting that you have is talking about guiding principles. Like, what are our overarching sort of philosophies like going into this? Are we all aligned? And when I say guiding principles, it could be things like, how are we thinking about segmentation as we go into it? What is our commitment to thinking about which levers are the strongest ones to pull, right? And so you don't go off in isolation or out into the ether and build like a beautiful model and come back and folks are just like, what am I to do with this, right? And so I think it's just really important to have that early discussion and bring them along for the ride and tactically like have those calendar meetings set up for you to dedicatedly talk about this and like chip away at the plan. And so that every step of the way, folks understand, your leaders understand what they're committing to, have an opportunity to chime in, have an opportunity objection, share the objections, have the opportunity to sort of like discuss. And I think that's an important one for RevOps to facilitate as well. Like your marketing and sales leaders are always going to have that push-pull conversation and being that voice of reason, again, as we talked a lot about,
Mm.
and helping navigate that conversation as well.
Yeah, great advice. And again, another plug for the reason why a planning calendar is so important. We can flip to the next slide. So now that we know what RevOps role should be, we have to have all the right ingredients to have successful planning. And I want to start off here on the data-driven insights and the validated realistic fundamental assumptions. A plan is basically a set of a whole bunch of assumptions. We're going to continue to perform on win rates the way that we historically have, or we're going to increase them, or we're going to have an outbound SDR team or not an outbound SDR team. Our ramp is going to be 6 months versus 5 months or 7 months. All of these things go in to the plan of how you're going to get to your goals. And if you don't have as validated assumptions, I won't say accurate because, there's always, where are the outliers, what should it be? But if you don't have as much visibility and insights into where they're tracking and why, and the levers you can pull to change them, your plan is just going to be wrong. It's just going to be wrong from day one, and you're never going to get yourself out of it. You're going to be in a constant state of firefighting.
Yeah.
So getting all of these inputs and all of this data so that you can start to create your plan is incredibly important. And I want to share some, and I'm going to look at some notes that I took of many of those insights that you want to start evaluating. And much of it is done by the RevOps team and not necessarily shared broadly outside of some of the key KPIs that talk to key trends or support key initiatives. There's obviously the sales execution bucket for KPIs, your ASP, your velocity, your win rates, your revenue pacing. In other words, on day 60 of the quarter, you should be day 50, or you should be 50% through your number. These should always be done by sales motion or segment, and even broken up into geography because they all look different. They're all at different stages of maturity. They have different sort of leaders. The next really important one are your pipeline generation and conversion rates. So where are you creating pipeline? What are the channels and sources? Who is then taking those and moving it through the middle of funnel? SDRs, what type of SDRs, AEs? What are your conversion waterfalls? So when do you actually need to create pipeline in order to close it, and how much do you
Yeah.
need to offset it, and what does that waterfall look like? Um, And then, of course, the coverage ratios that you need throughout by your sales stages and throughout the time of quarter. Your coverage ratios on day one are different than on day 30 and day 60. And again, all of these depend on the segment and motion. How much pipeline do you need to create so that you start off day one of next quarter with the right amount? How much pipeline do you need to create in the quarter for create and close, which many high velocity businesses have? Then you need to understand all of your hiring and attrition numbers. Attrition, not just a rate, but the
Yeah.
seasonality. It always happens in the first day of every new quarter, or it's higher in the first month of Q1 and the first month of Q3. And you need to understand why so you can better management. You need to understand, are you hiring on time? Doesn't matter what your hiring plan is, because if you're always late hiring, you're not going to build capacity and your hiring velocity. You need to understand all of your quota capacity, your street quota based on number of reps, the attainment that they have to the quota, the attainment factor or the cushion you want to build into your numbers. So how many heads that you need. You want to understand how they're performing in terms of contribution, how many reps are actually closing anything, how many are getting to 50% or more, 100% more of your quota, and what does the Pareto look like? Are 20% of your reps delivering 50% of your business? This is both with quota carrying sales reps and SDRs. You want to understand everything around your ramp, not just the amount of time, but the shape. It might be 0, 0, 0, 50, 75, 100, or 0, 25, 50, 75, or 100, and the attainment against that. And then there's a whole bunch of productivity KPIs, output per head, whether it's, ARR per sales rep, opportunities created by SDRs. There's a whole ton of those that you should be looking at to plan for, but then also to measure against. And then the role ratios. Do you want an 8-to-1 or a 10-to-1 ratio of sales reps to managers? How many SEs do you need per sales reps? And understanding all of these, and of course, all of the cost ones. I know that was a lot that I threw out. We do have a slide at the end of this, which shows a whole bunch of them, which we won't cover, but you can look at. And
Yeah.
also a little plug, we're about to publish the second series in our big book of Revcasting here at Revcast, in which we're talking about all of these KPIs and many more, describing what they are, showing you how to calculate them, showing you how to present them, giving you some interpretations and putting them in the scorecard. So that resource will be available to help you through all of these. That was a lot. Shriya, there's probably several other things on here that you can talk to as well that are key ingredients to success.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you covered a lot, and my sort of fine point in all of this might just be that the model is extremely important. I think it creates this like basis for you to go back to understand like what were the inputs and the assumptions that you made in order to arrive at your plan number, and therefore as you're tracking in your forecast and actuals through the course of the year, it's always a good, again, like home base to go back to, right, and understand and tweak and update. But I will also say that planning is as much an art as it's a science. And maybe the piece of advice I would share is ultimately you can make a very complex and intertwined plan with a lot of different components, but it has to be practical and actionable, which is I think where Jeff, like your point about like all of this like waterfall of the funnel performance has to feed into the practical application of like, who do you need to hire? How many people do you need to hire? Over what time period do you need to hire? And how do you make sure they're successful in terms of like even quota assignments, right? Being reasonable about what is necessary for folks to feel motivated and hit targets, but balance that with the company risk that you have to manage in terms of efficiency, and that's where I think some of the art comes in. And this is my long way of saying also that don't spend too much trying to like chase some false sense of precision. Like get to a point where you feel good and good enough. And again, this is where um, you have to play a role as RevOps to strike that balance with your leaders. And especially leaders external to go to market, specifically in the finance org, who might be trying to optimize for like, things that fit their financial model as well. But I think, again, we have to be like that voice of reason that helps bring some rationality to all of this. against, with the foundations of a really strong plan.
Yeah, those are great points, and I want to touch a bit on scenario planning, and it looks like the point that just put into the chat is really important. Your plan is just one of the many paths to get to your target. There are many permutations, many paths to get there. Not every KPI that I mentioned needs to be optimized. It's quite all right if someone there stay at the baseline of where they are. The ability to model those out and have a discussion about how easy they are, how much investment needs to be made, how risky they are, what your likelihood of success is, and in what combination you put those together is incredibly, incredibly important. So leave yourself enough time to do that and use a
Yeah.
flexible model or a solution to do that. Create an aggressive plan, create a conservative plan, create a couple in between, create one that does go aggressively up market and one that doesn't,
Yeah.
and take a look at all of those. But we did write something down here, informed bets versus hopeful bets.
Yeah.
And I've heard you say that a lot when we work together. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about what you mean by that and how you
Yeah.
determine whether it is informed or hopeful?
Yeah, this one's a bit near and dear to my heart, also because I think of the season that we've all come out of, I hope, in a lot of ways over the last couple of years, where there also has been this mentality, at least in startup land, around like grow at all costs, right? And there's a lot of like VC and CEO pressure to develop these plans that are, shall I say, not always based in reality. And I think this is where scenario planning really becomes to be helpful. And this is your classical sort of like worst, likely and best case scenarios. And as the name sort of describes, having a sense of like, what does like a worst case scenario look like if things don't play out, if all the bets that you're or maybe even like the most practical bets that you're taking don't play out, likely because of things that are, out of your control. Again, as we all sort of face in the last like 18 to 24 months, with sort of like the broader macro conditions. And then there's like your mid case scenario, which should take into account sort of like in the series of like bets that you can make or levers that you can pull. This is sort of like the bet that expects like majority of your, again, practical bets that you have very strong reasons to believe in playing out with some sort of a stretch, and your best case plan kind of being where everything happens beautifully and all that product that the product team said they're going to delivers on time precisely, and the bet that we've made around how much revenue we can get from it all kind of plays out, right?
Yeah.
I think it's important to have that sort of like flexibility and that breadth of assumptions to have a good sense of where you want to land and where, as a business, you want to take more risks in a plan versus where you want to be more tempered, in terms of like the reality of like well-oiled motions that don't have a lot more to like, get juice out of. And I think it's also helpful in terms of setting then the expectation around what is the plan you might want at the board level versus the company level versus the, go-to-market level, right? All of which could be slightly different. And, with the board plan probably being the most risk adjusted. And so I think this is where like, that scenario planning is really helpful. And we'll talk more about this when in the case study where, you actually in practical terms should flush out like all the levers that are possible and then sort of stack rank them in terms of like impact and what is more realistic in terms of execution ability. And therefore, which ones of those are you going to sort of pull as a lever in your actual planning?
Yeah, absolutely. The one I want to mention before we move off of this, and I see a question in the chat, which I'll address, is once again, it needs to be connected across the entire go-to-market supply chain. If you're building different models in different groups and multiple spreadsheets that are not connected or you're not communicating, your plan is broken. You cannot have marketing assume a conversion rate and have sales assume a different conversion rate, for example, or have both of them assume a different ASP. Now, those are obvious ones, but all too often you walk into a room at the end of it and you realize those fundamental assumptions that both teams are using are different. There is a question and it asks, is there a reference of what are the most common scenario data points a team should look at. I'll start off and then curious to what you think, Shriya. I think at
Yeah.
the end of the day, what I've seen is it often comes down to cost, which for a sales team especially, and for marketing, are people and marketing spend. And there's always a desire to reduce that, but you still want to get those big growth numbers. So you start then looking at the things that drive that, and that's quota. But then you have to look at the data around quota, quota attainment, rep contribution, the productivity. It's assumptions around win rate and ASPs. The better you have for both of those, the more that any individual sales rep can deliver, the less sales reps that you need. So that's where the reality of understanding these scenarios and making those informed versus hopeful bets and coming out with those rocks and those peoples and understanding the levers. It's ramp time as well. Don't just shorten ramp if you never actually hit that ramp before without any idea of how you're going to do that. So again, those fundamental assumptions, each and every one of them are typically looked at in a scenario of, well, if we are able to increase this one, how can we increase it? Again, what is the likelihood and the success and the investment required? A lot, very unlikely. Okay, let's leave that one here and let's look at the other one. So I would say that it's an iterative process of looking at all of those and ultimately seeing how they impact headcount, which is the biggest driver of cost.
Yeah, I like what you said about the cost, Jeff, because it brings for me to mind again, the person that bugs you most about cost is your CFO. But then it pulls you also into this idea that it has to be more than go to market. It has to be tied to what company goals are. And so I think this is where, like, in the previous slide, as we talked about, the very first step in all of this has to be alignment with your finance team, who's reflecting the broader company goals and who's looking at it like sort of big picture at that level, right? And so what are the efficiencies that we need to hit? And therefore, both the revenue and on the cost side, what all needs to come together for us to bake into our assumptions and our plan. Um, I think as far as like the actual like common scenario data points, it's a tough one to answer because the things that matter could also vary a lot depending on the stage of life your business is in. At the earlier stages, you may care a little less about things like efficiency because you're just trying to dump a ton of volume at the very top of the funnel. And at later stages, you might be fine tuning a lot of that a lot more. So I think you kind of need to pay attention to where you're at, going back to sort of like what your company level goals are. But when it comes down to it, for me, funnel is king or queen. You really need to understand the dynamics of like, the lead that comes into the very top of your funnel and how that sort of like flows through. And in that process, one thing I introduced at Intercom and feel very passionately about to this date is having a strong understanding of cohorted performance. I think folks often underappreciate the importance of this because as a result, I think, and the topic that we'll talk about next, get false understandings of if marketing ramps up this month, we're going to see revenue this month, and it never happens. So have a really strong understanding of your sales cycle. Is it 45 days? Is it 90 days? Is it a 6-month sales cycle? Because that changes how your lead is going to come to fruition at the end by a lot. And then also understand how that then plays out in your install base and your existing business, right? Your acquisition model should be tied to your existing business model. And specifically, like having a good sense of like how a new customer behaves in their first year and how that's different for your existing base and longer tenured customer is going to be really important. And then how you make assumptions about how said customer will grow over time. And so really linking the two, and ultimately all of this, feeds into some of the things that we've talked about in terms of then, okay, if we're going to get X amount of revenue, then, how many reps do we need to make that happen? What is the quota then based on the efficiency targets that we're going after? It's all just so interconnected. But for me, that first step of understanding your funnel is just everything.
Got it. Thank you, Shriya. You want to start off on this one?
Yeah. So going back to my passions about, cohort conversion rates, I did talk a lot about how, we don't want to be chasing a false sense of precision. But at the same time, we don't want to also wildly miss forecasts, at least for the right reasons. Like, again, there are always going to be things beyond us that will flip forecast on its head, and we'll have to replan and replan. But I think that we also want to be prudent about things that are under our control. And I think this is where, you know, starting off with the wrong assumptions at the beginning is going to lead to a whole set of like the waterfall effects, right, of it, and land in a number that could be quite wrong. And this could have like massive effects, right? Because if you overestimate your revenue, you're going to be over hiring, and that's going to have consequences around like missed targets, missed quotas. Your achievement rates are going to be low, morale is going to be low. In the worst case, you're going to have to rejigger organizations and, let go of folks. On the flip side, if you underestimate revenue, it can actually be equally dangerous because you can't actually ramp up sales teams as quickly as we sometimes imagine. There are certain parts of the teams that you can, like SGRs or velocity roles might be easier to hire. But if you're a business that is upmarket, has longer sales cycle, does consultative sales, even underestimating your plan meaningfully could be dangerous because you may just not have the resources you need to hit the productivity levels you need to hit set goals. So getting this right, and this is the classic Goldilocks problem, right? Not too hot, not too cold, just right. It's tough, and I think this is where again scenario planning is helpful to understand like what are the buffers that you want to have between your plan, and I think also having sort of a very reasonable conversation with your CRO or heads of about, understanding leading indicators and therefore, taking action quickly is important, both in terms of like winding down costs or like increasing investments. Um, and so this is all to say that flexibility is important in terms of scenario planning. It's to say that invest a lot of time in the first part of your planning, which is assumptions, where you're getting the data from, what are the bets that you're making, and investing a lot of time collaboratively in getting the different minds together to pressure test these different things to set yourself up for success. Jeff, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, in the last, 2 years here at Revcast, I've been fortunate to talk to a lot of RevOps and finance and sales leaders and review a lot of plans, and almost all of them have major flaws, even at companies where they have the skill set and they have the teams to get them right. The majority of them, for example, don't include attrition assumptions, or they just apply a percentage by month, which is incorrect. If you are missing assumptions, or if they are so off, your plan, you might as well not even do it. It's not going to be based on reality. It's going to be wrong on day one. And therefore, you're going to be working to catch up all year, which means your resources, including RevOps, is going to be in a constant state of firefighting, adjusting, and you're not going to be able to spend time working on the strategic projects, which, quite frankly, we'd rather work on, which really make incremental change to the business. You're going to be behind from the start, and you're never going to get off of that. And you mentioned another good point. You may miss opportunity. Like if you're sending your ramps too long, you're hiring reps too early, and you're spending money. You can either save the money and invest it somewhere else, or you can actually drive some more growth while spending the same amount of money. So validating those assumptions, getting those KPIs and those KPI buckets that I talked about before, doing all of this before planning starts, making sure they're accurate, gaining the insights, building the narrative, bringing that sense of reality is so important to getting a better plan out there. We'll move to the next one in the interest of time. I want to make sure
Yeah.
we get to our case study. Again, you need to provide all of the inputs proactively. Planning is coming, gather those KPIs, look at the trends, build the visuals, create and validate and socialize the narratives, come in with your assumptions so that you can start off planning, having that right strategic discussion and not talk about, is the data right or is it not right? So be very, very prepared. proactively build the infrastructure throughout the year and create projects on your roadmap that help you do this even better next year. I'd rather just go to the next one, Shriya, so that we do get to the case study.
Yeah, let's do it. Oh yeah, this is an important one. But related to the previous slide too. Listen, the holidays have wrapped up. Jan 2nd has arrived. What do you now do, right? And I think this is where it's really important to have started planning early. And so for folks who have fiscal years that end in whenever you do it, really, I guess I'm thinking calendar year, but it could be a variety of different things. Um, it's important to, as part of your blueprint of planning, make sure that you have that buffer time for all the things that follow. There's a few things that are spelled out in the slide here, but there's a lot of like tactical things, as I mentioned earlier, including things like getting your business systems team to make the changes around lead routing, right? Like there's a new segmentation that we're implementing, so we need to introduce new routing mechanisms. There's tactical things like your existing business books have to be refreshed and you're developing new named account lists. You have to issue quotas and comp plans take time. So make sure that you bake in, that buffer or that time to do all the different like tactical things that need to bring the plan alive, which at its fundamentals include communicating the goals, which in practical terms are the quotas, right, to the reps, the leaders, ensuring that there's abundance of clarity around like what we're going after across what timelines, the tactical things like book building, routing, system changes. And all of this also comes together in, one of the biggest events that go-to-market goes through, just kickoff or sales conference, whatever you call it in your organization. And so make sure that you're baking enough time for that and tactically build that list. Jeff, I don't know if you remember, but like my team, Nate, et cetera, always had like a tracking sheet and a blueprint for like, not just like when has the plan been signed off by the
Yeah.
board, but okay, tactically, what are the 50 things? And I trust me, that
Yeah.
list used to go on for a long, like
Yeah.
document every single one of those things and get that going.
Including the communication plan.
Right.
I'll hit on two things here before we move on. One is every single one of the KPIs that you use for planning and every one of those fundamental assumptions needs to be tracked throughout the year. Again, even if you build the best plan, you will deviate from it, which is okay. Understanding those deviations, understanding the impacts of those deviations, understanding if they are going to take you off that path to get to your number, and constantly making adjustments. It's okay to make adjustments throughout the year. Mid-market's not performing well, enterprise is. You're supposed to hire 3 mid-market reps next quarter. Pause those, move one to enterprise, and create the signals for when you should hire the other ones. So you're constantly going to be doing that, which means you constantly need to measure all of those KPIs, gain insights, and make decisions, and ultimately take action against that. There is a question again that popped up from Michael: is how do you address the 30% drop in discovery meetings? There's a lot to unpack here, Michael. I mean, I would maybe start with internally of looking at, productivity by rep and what's changed. Are they new reps? Is there a different manager? The sort of individual level KPI performance. I would also then look at the quality of the leads that are coming from marketing. Has the source changed? Has the information that we have on them, has the setup been the same? Go in and look at them. What's changed there, if anything. And if you have a call recorder, I would start listening to a whole bunch of calls to understand how they're actually conducting. Or if they're not having these meetings, go look at the email exchanges and the things that the SDRs or others are doing in order to try to book these and close these. There's a whole bunch of internal things that you should be looking at as well. On the external side, you need to sort of get a sense of what's happening in the general market and whether you're tracking similarly to that, or whether you're tracking, similarly to some of the competitors or marketers, or even if there's a competitor that's popped up that people are going to. And then as Camilla piped in there, again, you got to look at everything internally. Are you targeting the right people? Has that targeting changed? Has their priorities changed? Are you using the right messaging? Test your way into discovering what's went there as well. This is probably a lot longer conversation, but those are a few things I can think of. off the top of my head. Let's go to the case study here.
Yeah.
So I mentioned that Shri and I have gone through this process several times together, and we want to walk through a little bit of our experience of doing this. That will hit on a number of things that we talked about. The first thing, again, that we've talked about and happened, really well at Intercom is company leadership, the C-suite working with the board of directors, set out the overall company objectives for the year. And this could be things like, let's invest in building this new product. And therefore, our business ops team would go through what sort of impact that can have, how much adoption and penetration and pricing and all of those things. Or it could be things like, let's really invest and expand in EMEA or build a channel team. So having them set those objectives, and maybe they're setting a high level one of like, we got to get at least 30 or 40% growth and we want to drive efficiency here, are all things that you need before you start kind of moving down that ladder into your own organization. Once that was done, we had a sales leadership offsite, and this is really the CRO and her direct reports, Shri and myself, a small group of people where we took 2 days to talk about these things, to talk about the lessons learned over the past year, the honest discussion about what's worked and what hasn't worked, what we could have done better, what we did well. And we would use that to create our rocks or our key initiatives for the sales organization at that time. And for example, and again, I'm reading some notes, is we had some early success one of these years and positive signals in our market team and in our enterprise team, but we hadn't fully committed to all of the investments needed to really make it go and to scale it. So we created a rock that we called upmarket moves. Another was we had a really, really high performing small business team. Closing deals, hitting their numbers, doing really well, but it wasn't the most efficient in the world. We wanted to drive efficiency in there because to gain efficiency in the company, that's where we were going to help contribute to that, partly to pay for the investment that we wanted to make in the upmarket moves in the enterprise team rock. So we created a rock, I think it was called Well-Oiled Machine. We always created a rock around people. I think that year it might have been career pathing and skills development. And we would come up with about 5 of these and we'd think of a name. We would flush out a statement for each one of these of what success would look like. And maybe that was a statement. Maybe that was a specific KPI. We didn't necessarily come up with the goal, but this is the one that we would see improved or like to have as that key one that we will monitor in order to track our improvement. And then we would take a little bit deeper of a look, and we didn't necessarily create all the pebbles or the initiatives below these, but we'd flush out a few key ones that we thought. For upmarket moves, working with marketing to build an ABM program, investing in building an ABM, an SDR ABM team, one that worked with those leads and those programs and those reps, for example. So we identified a few of those. But we didn't at this point put together, as Shriya said, the non-precision based analysis of how much these different initiatives or levers or pebbles could deliver or make the decision on which ones we wanted to prioritize or invest in. Kind of did it in our next offsite, which was all of managers. And that's where I'd like to hand it back over to Shriya to walk us through the rest.
Yeah, and so it was really helpful to vet these out with the managers for one, because ultimately this is the team that's going to tactically execute a lot of the things that you want done. And so it was a very collaborative effort. And as we kind of flush it out with them, got more insights into okay, what exactly can we do tactically? What feels reasonable versus a stretch? And starting to really put some numbers against it. And I think the numbers are important because you want to know what are the leading indicators or even lagging indicators of whether something is working or not, and take a very iterative approach to it, right? And so as you're seeing on the slide here, just as an example, for each one of these initiatives, actually having accountability around which teams are going to be going after it, having some sort of revenue estimate around it, and then building out actual KPIs, or in your org, you might call it OKRs, whatever flavor of it is. And then having that sort of also sense of impact, and stack ranking these. And that one's an important one because like if you miss a certain goal, you might have a higher tolerance for missing one that was a long shot versus one that's a bit more fundamental and foundational to your business. And so ultimately creating like this like set of like, KPIs and OKRs that you're going to start like tracking regularly. In our sort of like experience at Intercom, we had a multitude of meetings where these could be checkpoints at very tactical levels. It'd be sort of at the functional like SDR meeting, et cetera. At a more aggregated level, it was our internal go-to-market sales leader meeting. And at the very top of it was our cross-functional, I believe it was biweekly meeting with our COO and CEO and heads of other sort of like departments. And at different levels, you could have different granularity of like tracking all of this. And it was important because understanding, some of these leading indicators was helpful to then have the right conversations around like catching certain trends early and talking to your counterparts in marketing or success or wherever it may be on what are sort of like the tweaks that we need to make there for that to have that sort of like waterfall effect down, right? And so this was like a very helpful, I would say, construct. And it is iterative because again, you're not going to, especially for new bets, I think some of the ones that we had were around some new product introductions, you were experimenting with how to go to market with them. And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And I think it's important that you understand why they didn't work or why they worked, rather than sort of like hanging on the fact that we didn't hit X number of dollars. Whereas in some other initiatives, like some of the well-oiled machines that we have, I'd be way more concerned if something didn't hit there because that I think indicates something more innate or endemic to something that has historically worked for us. So this was a very, very helpful sort of like tabular construct, I think, for us to understand what our big bets are, what are the ones that we know we have to make work, and what are some of like our sort of long shot opportunities, creating a sense of accountability across the teams, creating a set of goals that we're tracking, including like leading indicators, and then having sort of like that responsibility and accountability over time to understand what's changing, and how we want to iterate.
Yeah, and just to reinforce 2 points, when we'd have the all sales leadership and management, so anyone that managed a person was at this offsite, we created all the pebbles and we decided which ones we were going to invest in. We made sure that when we all left that meeting, we were all bought in and we were all aligned and we all felt accountable to them. And we assigned ownership to them. And it wasn't just, the head of sales in North America or Shriya or me. It was in many cases frontline managers. And it was career development for them too, of driving some of these initiatives, of learning some skills and working with people that hadn't before. The other thing we did is we looked at the measurements that we put in the KPIs on a weekly basis. We didn't just look at them at the QBR whenever we felt like it. We managed and monitored these just as we did our quarterly number. And that's the way that you understand if you're tracking and if you're not, what to do, and holding the whole organization accountable to achieving the success in here, which is so important to reaching your revenue targets. Excellent. I think we can move to the next slide. I think this is a laundry list of many of those KPIs that I mentioned before. And if we go to the next one, we do have a lot of great content that we have at Revcast, which I invite you to go take a look at, including several models and details of many of the things that we talked about today. So you did mention we are publishing our big book, Volume 2, The Essential KPIs for Revenue Insights, which will, again, describe a whole bunch of those and more of those KPIs that you just saw, give examples, talk about how to calculate them, give some interpretation of how you might want to use them, some visuals of how you might want to incorporate them in there. So when that comes out, we'll distribute it, and please make sure you take a look at that. I think if there's any questions, we can take them now.
Sorry, 1 second. I don't see any questions currently, but if folks have general questions about things they're seeing in their business or want like some kind of, we're happy to dig into that a bit more. But thank you both. This has been very thorough and Really appreciate that list of KPIs. Who should RevOps report to? Michael, you know exactly.
The most controversial question of all.
Oh, woke up and chose violence, Michael. I like it.
I don't think there's a definitive answer yet, and I think a lot of it depends on how your organization is structured. I think if there is a president or COO that has all of go-to-market, it's them. If there isn't, I agree with you, Camilla. I think it's the CRO who ultimately is the most accountable and is the first one that gets fired. So you might disagree on that, but I think that's why it makes it interesting to see how this ultimately plays out.
Sure.
Yeah.
What are your feelings?
I would not report to the CFO, by the way.
God, no.
I don't think
And
they're accountable directly.
And I've had people tell me you have to at a publicly held company because of data restrictions and requirements, and that is just not true.
Yeah.
Because I have worked at several publicly. Anyway, sorry, Shriya, I cut in.
No, I think +1 to everything that you guys have said. Ultimately, I think it also depends on the culture of the company. Like, I have seen this recent trend about reporting to the CFO. Is it the best? I don't think so, but I also don't. I think if it is at a company where there is a very collaborative culture, the CFO is someone who has a strong understanding and perspective about the importance of like sales, and you have and structurally enable and allow for like, you know, the close collaboration with the CRO. So your de facto sort of like dotted line reporting to the CRO. I think it could work, but I agree that it's not the most optimal. But I think for it to work, you need to have that strong sort of very collaborative and culture where you're still attached to the hip to whoever the revenue owner is.
Yeah, it like anything else in this world, it depends. It's why I get really frustrated when people say that the best RevOps leaders come from X discipline or Y discipline. I don't care if you come from marketing ops, sales ops, CS ops. You have to have a certain mentality and ability to step back and be impartial and focus where the business needs it the most, as opposed to where you're the most familiar. So I get really frustrated when people say it should be this or that and don't focus on the mentality of the department lead and what they're responsible for. We have a great question. As you've been doing planning over the years, what has surprised you the most? I have a list. Love to hear what you think.
It surprised me the most.
I would say that over the years, how much time you spend planning and convince yourself that you have a reality-based plan, but you're actually always signing up for like the most aggressive plan in the world that's never going to work. So it's surprising that everybody gets behind their plan and has to adjust, and then they do the same thing next year without, you know, learning the lessons of let's make it reality-based and understand where the upside is. Far more time into planning and far less time looking at some of the long-term planning KPIs and fundamental assumptions versus quarterly and monthly forecasts once you get into the year.
I'm always surprised by how far off reality some leaders are in terms of what their actual stats are. So like a sales leader quoting 3.5x coverage, when in reality it varies from 11 to 17.
Yes.
Really frustrating.
Yeah. And to add on that, you know, you might have an enterprise rep that ramped in 4 months and one that took 10 months. The lack of investigating why, so that you can get more of them towards 4 months. So again, I think you're looking at numbers and taking averages opposed to why is that one better and what we can do to make them all better, right?
Yep.
Our company has 6 brands and 20 channels and always a lack of resources. If you could pick the top 5 things to get a good ballpark for planning, what would those be?
Wow.
Yeah.
I think you have to look at rep productivity and attainment to quota, and those trends. So as you're adding more, I think you have to look at, Shriya mentioned before, your funnel conversion rates. I think you have to look at your you know, your overall headcount. Are you getting enough people in seat to get to your number? What does your attrition look like? I think reps are so critical to both cost and building up productive street quota. And I don't know if that was 4 or 5. But I do think then you have to look at some sort of Uber, you know, productivity or efficiency number, whether it's a CAC or something else, to understand whether you're improving that or not.
Yeah, I always look to CAC to LTV. Shreya, do you?
Yeah, maybe a slightly different flavor of that, I would say, is like start with your priority brands and channels. Like, yes, you have 6 brands and 20 channels, but there is, you know, as in life, probably a smaller percentage of that contributes to an outsized percentage of your actual like revenue. And so get that part done really right, because you don't want to miss or you don't want to have a bigger miss in either direction on the fundamentals that feed your business, and then figure out which ones are the bigger bets that you're making, where you could take maybe a more loose approach in planning, because you can afford to be more wrong there. So yeah, that would sort of be my like added sort of insight here, is be very clear on like what is sort of your bread and butter, and there's lower risk tolerance to miss that, versus like, you know, the couple of brands or the couple of channels that are newer, that it is going to be squishier. And so don't try to chase some, again, false sense of precision on those.
Yeah, I like her answer better than mine.
Fantastic.
Easier to
So-
tweak than come up with things from scratch, Joe.
So thank you both so much for the examples, sharing your knowledge. I really, really appreciate it. For those of you on the call, please do take the survey on the way out to let us know how we're doing, where we can improve. This has been fantastic. Again, thank you. And I hope everyone has an excellent day.
Thank you, Shriya, and thank you everybody for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.